Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into the story of Mark and Eleanor, a young law student and an older millionaire, whose unusual marriage contract takes a surprising turn. Mark Davis trudged along the slick sidewalk, the dark clouds above casting a gloomy shade over the small Texas town. At 23, he was fighting to make it through his final year of law school. His father's debts were piled high, and despite working a part-time job at a local diner, he could barely keep up. Life was a constant struggle, one that seemed to close in around him every day. The weight of the world felt heavy on his shoulders as he pulled his worn backpack tighter against his back. He glanced at his phone as it buzzed with a message. Mark Davis, please meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 p.m. It's important. The message was from Eleanor Brooks, a name he didn't recognize, but one that carried an unmistakable air of authority. The tone of the message, cool and commanding, sent a chill down his spine. He didn't have time to waste, but something about this invitation made him stop and think. The chance of a better future, or at least an escape from his current struggles, lingered in his mind as he made his way to the bistro. The rain had started to pour just as Mark arrived at Brooks Bistro, a place far more upscale than anything he was accustomed to. His jacket clung to him as he stepped inside, greeted by the soft glow of amber lights and the smell of fresh coffee and pastries. He barely had time to dry off before he was escorted to a corner table where Eleanor was waiting. Mark, she greeted, her voice smooth and controlled, betraying no hint of warmth but a steady authority. Please sit. Her silver hair, neatly styled, and the immaculate suit she wore made her seem like a woman who had everything in control. There was no mistaking her power, and Mark felt suddenly out of place, his worn clothes and damp shoes a stark contrast to her polished appearance. He took a seat across from her, his nerves making it difficult to even focus on her face. Ms. Brooks? I didn't expect, he trailed off, unsure of what he was even trying to say. She cut him off, her eyes narrowing slightly. Let's get to the point, Mark. I know about your situation, Eleanor said, her voice sharp as a knife. The debts your father left behind. The bills piling up. I know you're struggling, and I can offer you a solution. Mark blinked, still trying to process what she was saying. She paused for a moment, letting the tension build, before continuing. I need a husband, Eleanor stated simply, leaning forward just enough for Mark to feel the gravity of her words. But this is not about love. It's a business arrangement. If you agree, I will pay off your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you'll pose as my husband. Just for appearances. Mark stared at her, unsure if he had heard her correctly. A marriage contract, a business deal? Was this some sort of joke? He needed time to process, but Eleanor was already moving on, listing the terms. No love, no intimacy. You'll attend a few public events with me, pose for pictures, and play the role of a devoted husband. We'll keep this private, Mark, but it will secure your future, and I'll make sure you never have to worry about money again. Mark's mind raced. It all seemed too surreal, too perfect to be true. He glanced down at the table, his fingers curling around the edge of the menu as he tried to wrap his head around the offer. It wasn't just about the money, it was about survival. He could take the deal, live with the lies, and finally get his life back on track. Why me? He asked, his voice low, still not fully convinced. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Because you're young, unattached, and desperate enough to say yes. This isn't about love, Mark. This is about power and security. Her words were blunt, but there was no denying the weight of them. Mark thought about his mother's medical bills, his sister's tuition fees, the looming eviction notice he had just received. He knew he was on the verge of losing everything. He took a deep breath, and the answer that escaped his lips was one he would never forget. I'll do it, he said finally. Eleanor smiled, a cool, calculated expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good, she said, her tone shifting back to business. The arrangements will be made immediately. We'll begin tomorrow. As Mark stood to leave, Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. He had just agreed to something that could change his life forever. He didn't know it yet, But this decision would be the beginning of something he could never have anticipated. The rain had started to come down harder as Mark walked away from the bistro, his mind reeling from the offer Eleanor had laid out. He barely noticed the water soaking through his jacket as his thoughts raced. He had just agreed to something unimaginable, a marriage that wasn't even real, just a business transaction. His mind kept replaying her words, the coldness in her voice as she talked about how it wasn't about love, how she didn't need that. He couldn't stop thinking about his family, about how desperate he was to escape the crushing weight of his father's debts and his own struggles. Maybe this was his way out, a chance to finally breathe again. Mark spent the next few days in a blur. He tried to convince himself that he was making the right decision. He spent hours thinking about how his mother would finally have the money for her treatments, how his sister's tuition would no longer be a constant worry. But every time he tried to focus, he saw Eleanor's face, cold, calculating, but also determined. She was offering him security, and for someone like him, who had never known true stability, it felt like a lifeline. The following evening, Mark found himself sitting in a small, quiet office at the law firm he had been working at part-time. The phone on his desk was a constant reminder of his reality. A constant reminder that he didn't belong here, not really. He wasn't like the people who worked in this firm, polished, confident, self-assured. His fingers hovered over the keys of his laptop as he tried to write the letter of resignation he had been putting off for weeks. His mind was too cluttered, too uncertain. But he knew one thing for sure. He needed this opportunity. With Eleanor, his resignation from the firm, his future as a real lawyer, it all depended on it. The next morning, Mark met Eleanor again, this time in a private office at a law firm she had ties to. The air inside was thick with formality, the kind that made Mark feel out of place. Eleanor greeted him with her usual calm, almost distant demeanor. The lawyers from her side were present, all dressed in expensive suits, standing in sharp contrast to Mark's simple attire. Eleanor handed him a thick folder containing the contract, the very document that would bind him to her. She looked at him with a calm intensity, as though this was just another transaction, just another business deal. "Sign it," she said, her voice steady, yet there was an underlying tone of expectation. "Once you do, everything will change for both of us." Mark glanced down at the contract, the words jumping off the page, as if daring him to hesitate. But there was no time for hesitation. He needed this. The weight of his mother's bills, the possibility of losing everything. He couldn't afford to back out. He signed it, the pen moving mechanically across the page. As he did, a part of him couldn't help but wonder what this would mean for his future. He had just agreed to a life that wasn't his own, a life built on lies and pretense. But there was no turning back now. He handed the signed contract back to Eleanor, who didn't even glance at it. Her eyes remained on him, calculating, as if waiting for something. When she spoke, her words were clipped, deliberate. "We start tomorrow," Eleanor said. "This is just the beginning. Your role will be clear soon enough. For now, just follow the plan." Mark nodded silently, unsure of what he had just entered into, but understanding that there was no way out. As he left the office, the weight of his decision settled over him. He had just committed to a contract that would change his life forever, and yet, the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was still a stranger to Eleanor. She was someone he didn't really know, someone he hadn't even begun to understand. And yet here he was, bound to her, in a marriage that wasn't a marriage at all. The days that followed were filled with meetings, events, and photo shoots, all part of the public facade they were now creating. Mark did his best to play the part of the devoted husband, but it never felt real. He was still just pretending, still just going through the motions. He couldn't help but wonder what Eleanor thought of him, what she saw when she looked at him. Was he just a tool to her? A way to get ahead, a way to maintain her public image? But then, one evening, something unexpected happened. It was a quiet moment, just the two of them in her penthouse apartment, after a long day of public appearances. They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them thick, almost palpable. Then, Eleanor spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I didn't want this life," she said, her words taking Mark by surprise. "I didn't want to be alone, to have everything but no one to share it with. I wanted someone to be real with, someone to talk to without pretending. I thought this marriage, this deal, would fix things, but it hasn't." And now, she trailed off, her gaze shifting to the floor. And now, I don't know what I'm doing anymore. Mark sat in stunned silence. The woman who had seemed so cold, so unreachable, was finally showing a side of herself he hadn't expected. It was in that moment, as he watched her, that he began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this arrangement than either of them had planned. But would it be enough? Would their fake marriage turn into something real, or was it too late for either of them to change? The days that followed felt like a blur for Mark. He moved through his new life, playing the role of a husband in public, but it felt like he was living in someone else's skin. Eleanor had made it clear from the start that their marriage wasn't about love, that it was purely for business. But still, something in the way she looked at him, the rare moments when her guard slipped, made him question if maybe there was something more to this arrangement. But every time he tried to dig deeper, to ask her what she really wanted, she would retreat, pulling the walls back up around her. One evening, after another exhausting round of meetings and events, they found themselves alone again in the penthouse. The city lights outside the floor-to-ceiling windows cast a soft glow over the room. The silence between them felt heavier than usual, as if there were unspoken words hanging in the air. Mark was sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, when Eleanor entered the room. She was dressed in a loose blouse, her usual sharpness replaced by an unusual weariness. She paused for a moment, studying him, before speaking in a quiet voice. "Mark, do you ever wonder if this was a mistake?" The question caught him off guard. He hadn't expected her to be the one to voice what had been creeping into his own mind for weeks. He looked up at her, trying to read the emotion in her eyes. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice soft. Eleanor took a step closer, her gaze dropping to the floor before meeting his eyes again. "I've spent so much of my life building an empire, making deals, gaining power, but it never felt real. And now, I'm trapped in this contract. And I don't even know who I am anymore." Her voice cracked just slightly, and for the first time, Mark saw the vulnerability in her that she had so carefully hidden. Mark's heart softened, his own doubts about their arrangement rising to the surface. He had been so focused on surviving, on escaping the weight of his family's debts, that he hadn't really stopped to consider Eleanor's perspective. She was a woman who had everything on the outside: wealth, power, success. But clearly, it had come at a cost. "I don't know what we're doing either," Mark admitted, his voice low. "But maybe we're both just trying to survive. Maybe that's all we've been doing, surviving. But what happens when that's all you ever do? You end up alone, even when you're surrounded by people." Eleanor's eyes softened at his words, and for a moment, the tension between them seemed to ease. She sat down beside him on the couch, her posture less rigid than usual, as though she was letting herself breathe for the first time in ages. They sat in silence for a long time, both of them processing what had just been said. Neither of them had expected to get this vulnerable, but it felt real, like they were finally seeing each other for who they truly were, not just the roles they had been playing. After a few moments, Eleanor turned to him, her face a mixture of frustration and something softer, something that looked almost like hope. "Mark, I didn't want to need anyone. I didn't want to be vulnerable. But I do. And maybe that's the scariest thing of all. Maybe that's what I'm really afraid of." Mark's heart raced as he looked at her, the realization hitting him hard. She was scared of needing someone, just like he had been. They were both trapped by their own fears and the walls they had built around themselves. It wasn't just the contract that had bound them together. It was their shared isolation, their need for something real, something to fill the emptiness that had been growing inside them for years. He reached out, hesitated, and then placed his hand gently on hers. "I'm scared too, Eleanor. But maybe, just maybe, we can stop pretending. We don't have to be perfect. We just need to be real." Eleanor didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she looked down at their hands, her fingers curling around his, and for the first time in their fake marriage, they weren't just playing roles. They were two people, sharing something real, something fragile, but maybe, just maybe, something worth holding on to. As the night wore on, they talked more, about everything and nothing. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. They both knew their marriage was far from the fairy tale they had imagined, but at that moment, it didn't matter. They were no longer just pretending. And as the hours passed, Mark realized that perhaps this was the beginning of something neither of them had expected. But as Eleanor stood up to leave the room, a thought lingered in Mark's mind. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding something real, something worth fighting for. And he wasn't sure where this would lead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking away now. The days that followed were a strange mix of routine and unease. Mark and Eleanor continued their public appearances together, but the private moments they shared were far more complicated. In the weeks since their conversation on the couch, something had shifted between them, but neither of them could bring themselves to talk about it openly. There was an unspoken tension, a growing connection that neither was ready to admit. Mark found himself looking at Eleanor in a way he hadn't before, seeing past the powerful CEO to the woman beneath the polished exterior. And Eleanor, despite her best efforts to maintain her distance, couldn't help but soften whenever he was near. One evening, after another charity event, Mark and Eleanor found themselves back in her penthouse. The night had been a blur of smiles, handshakes, and forced conversations with strangers. It had all felt so fake. But in the quiet of her apartment, the tension from the event seemed to evaporate, leaving them in a space that felt more intimate than it ever had before. Eleanor poured them both a glass of wine, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she handed one to Mark. She hadn't meant to act this way. She hadn't meant to let him get so close, but somehow, he had. "You're different, Mark," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I'm with you, it's not just a role I'm playing. It's like," she paused, searching for the right words. "It's like I can finally breathe." Mark looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. He had felt the same way, but he wasn't sure how to process it. They were supposed to be playing a part, but this, whatever this was, wasn't part of the plan. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I know what you mean," he said slowly, his gaze meeting hers. "It's like everything else falls away when I'm with you." He didn't say the words out loud, but he knew what he meant. This wasn't just a contract anymore. This was something real. The silence between them stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was different, gentle, almost like the quiet before a storm. Eleanor set her glass down on the table, her fingers brushing against Mark's as she did. Neither of them pulled away. The touch was fleeting, but it carried a weight of its own. It was a silent admission of what they were both feeling but hadn't yet acknowledged. "I never expected this," Eleanor murmured, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I never thought I would need someone. I thought I had everything figured out." She paused, the words catching in her throat. "But now, I'm not so sure anymore." Mark could hear the vulnerability in her voice, something he had never heard before. It was a side of her that she had kept hidden, even from him. He reached out, his hand brushing hers once more, this time lingering longer. "You don't have to have everything figured out," he said softly. "None of us do. We're all just trying to find our way." For a long moment, Eleanor didn't speak. She simply stared at their joined hands, her mind racing. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. She had spent so many years building her empire, pushing people away, never allowing herself to be vulnerable. And now, here she was, admitting that she needed someone. Mark, a man who, just months ago, she would have dismissed as a stranger. Mark, sensing her hesitation, leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Eleanor, I know we're not supposed to feel this way. I know we agreed that this was just a contract, but," he faltered for a moment, unsure of where his words would take him. "But it's real, isn't it? What we're feeling. I can't ignore it anymore." "Neither can you." Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. No walls. Just the raw, unspoken truth of what was growing between them. Eleanor's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. She didn't need to say anything. The truth was clear in the way she was looking at him. There was no turning back. "I think we've both been running from this," Mark continued, his voice a little more confident now. "From the idea that maybe we could have something real, something more than just a business deal." He reached for her hand, holding it firmly in his. "I'm not running anymore." Eleanor's breath caught, her heart racing in her chest. She wanted to pull away, to retreat into the cold, calculated world she had always known. But something in Mark's eyes, something real, made her stay. She squeezed his hand, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not running either." The moment hung between them, charged with everything they had left unsaid. They didn't know what the future held or what would happen next, but in that moment, they both knew that whatever this was, it was real, and it was only just beginning. The following weeks, were a whirlwind of emotions and confusion for Mark and Eleanor. Neither of them expected what had started as a simple business arrangement to evolve into something more. They continued to maintain the facade in public, attending events together, smiling for photos, and performing their roles. But in the quiet moments, when they were alone, everything felt different. The unspoken connection between them had only deepened, and both were beginning to struggle with the implications of their feelings. One evening, after a particularly grueling gala, Mark found himself standing in the doorway of Eleanor's penthouse, his hand still on the doorknob, as if unsure whether he should enter. He had spent the entire evening watching her interact with others, her usual confident, composed self on full display. But when the event was over, he had noticed something in her eyes, a vulnerability that was so unlike the Eleanor he had known. He had never seen her like this before. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor was sitting on the couch, her back turned to him, staring out the large windows that overlooked the city. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the lights barely illuminating the space. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say or do. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "Eleanor." His voice was tentative, as if testing the waters. She turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. There was a hint of exhaustion in her expression, something that hadn't been there before. "Are you okay?" She sighed deeply, rubbing her forehead with her hand, as if trying to erase the fatigue. "I don't know, Mark," she said quietly. "I don't know what's real anymore. I've spent so much of my life pretending, playing a role. But now, with you, it's different, and I don't know how to handle it." Mark took a step closer, his heart aching as he listened to her words. He could see the walls she had built around herself starting to crumble, and it made him realize just how much she had been hiding. He moved to sit beside her, not saying anything at first. Instead, he simply sat in silence, letting the weight of her emotions fill the space between them. After a long pause, Eleanor spoke again, her voice softer now. "I've spent so much time protecting myself, keeping everyone at arm's length. But now, I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep doing that. I don't know if I can keep pretending that this," she gestured between them, "isn't real." Mark reached out, gently taking her hand in his. He had never imagined that his life would take him down this path, that he would find himself sitting here with Eleanor Brooks, the woman he had once seen as a distant, almost untouchable figure. But now, in this moment, everything felt raw, real. "Eleanor, you don't have to pretend with me. We've both been pretending for so long. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt, but she found none. Instead, she saw only honesty, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The vulnerability in her expression softened, and for the first time, she allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his touch. "I don't know where this is going," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I don't want to keep pretending that we're just playing a part. I think we both deserve something real." Mark squeezed her hand gently. "We do. And I'm willing to figure it out with you, step by step. We don't have to have all the answers right now. We just need to take it one day at a time." For the first time in what felt like forever, Eleanor smiled, a soft, hesitant smile that reached her eyes. It was the first time she had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could have something real together. As they sat in the silence that followed, neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time, they were willing to face it together. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but Mark and Eleanor had finally let down their guard, opening themselves to the possibility of something more. And in that moment, they both knew they had taken the first step towards something they had never expected, a real connection, born out of vulnerability, trust, and the courage to be honest with each other. Weeks passed, and the more time Mark and Eleanor spent together, the harder it became to ignore the growing connection between them. They continued to maintain the public appearance of a perfect couple, but behind closed doors, things were changing. Their conversations grew deeper, their moments together more intimate. Eleanor, who had once been so guarded, was slowly letting Mark in, and Mark, in turn, was beginning to understand the woman behind the empire she had built. One morning, Mark woke up early to find Eleanor already up and standing by the large windows, looking out over the city. The soft light of the morning sun illuminated her face, casting a warm glow around her. For a moment, Mark simply watched her, admiring how different she seemed now compared to when they first met. Closed off, distant, almost unapproachable. But now, he could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the softening of her posture as she no longer held herself up with walls. He walked over to her, his steps slow and measured, as though he didn't want to disturb the peace of the moment. He stood beside her, looking out at the city below. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable now, no longer filled with tension or uncertainty, but with the unspoken understanding that they were both in a new place with each other. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. "I never thought I could feel this way," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I spent so many years thinking I didn't need anyone. I built this life, this empire, because I thought it would fill the emptiness I felt inside. But now I realize that it was all just a distraction from the real thing." Mark turned to face her, his heart racing as he listened to her words. He could hear the raw honesty in her voice, the weight of everything she had been carrying for so long. "What's the real thing?" he asked, his voice gentle, as though he was afraid to break the moment. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes softening. "Love. Real love. I didn't think it was something I needed. But now, I'm not so sure." She paused, searching his face for any sign of doubt. "Mark, I don't know what this is. I don't know if I'm ready to fully let go of the person I used to be, the person I had to be to get here. But I'm willing to try." Mark's heart skipped a beat at her words. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the conflict between the woman she had always been and the woman she was allowing herself to become. He stepped closer to her, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," he said quietly. "We're both figuring this out. But I know one thing for sure. I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere." Eleanor's eyes glistened as she looked up at him, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe the words he was saying. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been so scared to need someone, to let someone in. But I think I'm ready to try. I think I'm ready to need you." Mark smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "And I'm ready to be here for you. All the way." The moment between them felt like a turning point, a quiet but powerful realization that they were no longer just pretending. What had started as a contract, a business arrangement, was now evolving into something far more meaningful. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time, both of them were willing to face the future together, without the fear that had once kept them apart. As the morning light filled the room, Eleanor turned toward him, her heart beating a little faster. She wasn't sure what would come next. There were still so many uncertainties, so many fears that needed to be addressed. But for the first time, she didn't feel alone in them. And as they stood there together, hands clasped, both of them knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that they would write together. It had been a few days since Mark and Eleanor had shared that quiet, intimate moment together, and the shift in their relationship was palpable. The walls between them had come down, but the world outside still expected them to maintain the same facade. They attended more events, more galas, more business dinners where they were expected to act like the perfect couple. But each time they returned to the privacy of Eleanor's penthouse, it was as if the pretense faded away, leaving only the raw, honest connection they were beginning to build. But as their bond grew stronger, so did the pressure to keep up appearances. Eleanor, ever the perfectionist, began to feel the strain. The public image she had so carefully cultivated was starting to blur with her real emotions. She was no longer just playing a role. She was beginning to care, really care, about Mark. And that scared her more than anything. One evening, after another exhausting gala, Eleanor found herself standing by the window, staring out at the city. Mark had already changed into his usual relaxed clothes, but he didn't approach her right away. He could sense something was off, but he didn't want to push. It wasn't like before, when she would keep her distance. He could feel the vulnerability in her, the quiet struggle that she hadn't yet voiced. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "Mark, I don't know if I can keep doing this. This whole thing. The contract, the pretending, the constant public scrutiny." She turned to face him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "It's like I've given so much of myself to this image, to this life I thought I wanted. But now..." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Mark stepped closer, his heart heavy with understanding. He had been feeling the same way. But he also knew that what they were building, This real connection between them was worth more than any contract, any public appearance. He gently placed his hand on hers, his voice steady. Eleanor, you don't have to keep pretending for anyone. Not for me. Not for anyone else. He paused, searching her eyes. This is real. And whatever happens next, we'll face it together. I'm not going anywhere. Her gaze softened, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of relief. Mark wasn't just there for the role he was supposed to play. He was there for her, for the real her, the woman she had been hiding behind her empire. She hadn't realized how much she had been craving that until now. I'm scared, Mark, Eleanor admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I've spent so long building this life, making sure I never needed anyone. But now, she took a deep breath, the weight of her emotions almost too much to bear. Now I need you, and I don't know how to navigate that. Mark's heart ached as he watched her struggle with her vulnerability. He gently cupped her face, his touch tender but firm. You don't need to have all the answers right now. We're both figuring this out. But the one thing I know for sure is that I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. There was a quiet moment between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Eleanor's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of doubt, but all she found was certainty that he was in this with her, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. I never imagined I'd be here, Eleanor whispered, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I never imagined I'd need someone. But I do. I need you. Mark smiled back, the warmth in his chest spreading as he realized just how far they had come from that first moment they met. From a contract, a business arrangement, to something much more meaningful. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. As they stood there together, the city lights twinkling outside the window, they both knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges. But they also knew that they were no longer facing them alone. For the first time in their lives, they had something real. And that was enough. The weeks following their heartfelt conversation were a whirlwind of changes. Mark and Eleanor's relationship, once rooted in a contract, had evolved into something neither of them had expected. They were no longer just playing the parts they had agreed to. They were learning to navigate the complex emotions that had bloomed between them. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, times when Eleanor pulled away, caught in the fear of needing someone so deeply. But Mark, steady and patient, never wavered. He was there for her, every step of the way, showing her that she didn't have to face the world alone. One afternoon, as they sat in Eleanor's penthouse, the weight of their decision to stay in the contract for longer hung in the air. Despite the deepening connection between them, they still had to uphold the image they had created for the world. Eleanor had reluctantly agreed to attend a major charity gala, one where their relationship would be on full display. The cameras, the flashing lights, it was all part of the game they had to play. As the event grew closer, Mark found himself feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He knew how important this was for Eleanor's public image, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer to something monumental. They couldn't keep pretending forever. They had to make a decision about where this relationship was really heading. Eleanor, too, had been feeling the pressure. She stood by the window, looking out over the city as Mark walked into the room, dressed in his tuxedo, his expression serious but soft. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. She turned to face him, a look of uncertainty in her eyes. "I don't know," she admitted. "This gala, it feels like it's going to be a turning point. But I'm not sure I'm ready for what comes after it." Mark walked over to her, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to have everything figured out," he said. "What we've built together, it's real. That's all that matters. We'll face whatever comes next together." Eleanor met his gaze, her heart beating faster at the sincerity in his voice. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She didn't need all the answers. She didn't need to control every aspect of her life. She just needed to trust in what they had built together, in the love that had started to grow between them. The night of the gala arrived, and the penthouse was buzzing with excitement. The press had gathered outside, eager to catch a glimpse of the perfect couple. Mark and Eleanor stood together, posing for photos, playing the part they had agreed to. But when the cameras weren't on them, they shared quiet moments of real connection. Eleanor would catch Mark's eye, and the world would disappear for a few seconds. In those brief moments, they weren't just playing a role. They were two people, sharing something real. As the night wore on, Eleanor found herself growing more comfortable in Mark's presence. They had danced together, laughed together, and even shared a private moment on the balcony, away from the flashing cameras. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor didn't feel the pressure to be perfect. She didn't have to keep up appearances. She could simply be herself, with Mark by her side. Later, as the gala came to an end, Eleanor stood with Mark on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. The noise from inside had faded, leaving them in a quiet, intimate space. Mark turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "So what now?" he asked softly. Eleanor looked at him, a mixture of emotions swirling inside her. She had spent so much of her life running from her feelings, from the fear of needing someone. But now, with Mark standing there, his presence comforting and real, she realized that maybe it was time to stop running. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I know that I don't want to keep pretending anymore. I don't want to keep living in this world where everything is about appearances. I want to build something real. With you." Mark smiled, his heart swelling with relief and joy. "We will. We'll build it, step by step." And in that moment, standing together on the balcony, Eleanor realized that she was no longer afraid of what the future might bring. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't alone. They had a long road ahead of them, but with Mark by her side, she was ready to face it all. As the weeks passed, Mark and Eleanor found themselves in a new rhythm, one that was less about pretending and more about truly discovering each other. They still had to attend events, make public appearances, and fulfill their roles, but the bond between them had become undeniable. The facade of their contract marriage was slowly fading away, replaced by something deeper, something real. It wasn't easy. There were moments when Eleanor would pull back, still haunted by her past fears of vulnerability. But each time, Mark was there, patient and unwavering, showing her that she didn't have to carry the weight of the world alone. One evening, after a particularly challenging day, Eleanor found herself at a crossroads. She sat at the kitchen table, staring down at the legal papers for their marriage contract, her fingers tracing the edges of the document. It had started as a simple arrangement, a business decision to solve her personal and professional issues. But now, it meant so much more. She had fallen for him, and the fear that had once kept her from opening her heart to anyone was slowly slipping away. Mark entered the room, sensing the weight of her thoughts. He didn't say anything at first, but simply sat down next to her, his presence steady and calming. After a moment, Eleanor turned to him, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "Mark, I never imagined that this contract would turn into something so real, something that I didn't even know I needed." He smiled gently, taking her hand in his. "I didn't expect it either. But sometimes, the things that seem the least likely turn into the most important." She nodded, her heart swelling with affection for him. "I've spent so long building walls, convincing myself that I didn't need anyone. But you," she paused, her voice catching. "You've shown me that I don't have to do everything alone. And I don't want to pretend anymore." Mark squeezed her hand, his eyes soft. "We don't have to pretend, Eleanor. Not anymore. We've built something real, and that's all that matters." In that moment, Eleanor knew that the fear she had carried for so long had finally been replaced with trust and love. They had both changed in ways they hadn't anticipated. Their journey together had begun as a lie, but it had blossomed into something genuine, something they had both fought for, whether they realized it at first or not. Later that evening, as they stood on the balcony of the penthouse, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Mark turned to her with a smile. "So what's next?" he asked, his voice filled with a quiet confidence. Eleanor looked out at the city, then back at Mark. "I don't know exactly, but I know I want to face it with you," she said, her voice steady now. "I want to build a life that's real. No more pretending. No more walls. Just us." Mark pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her. "I'm in. Whatever comes next, I'm in." As the night stretched on, they stood there, no longer a contract couple, but two people who had found love in the most unexpected of places. And though they didn't have all the answers, they knew one thing for certain. They were no longer afraid to face the future together. No longer afraid to build something that would last.